let's finish this. So I kept reading, I reassessed, and I have some conclusions and their conclusions. So this book really made me angry, and let's see where it goes. So regarding some general notes about what's going on, some. First off, patriarchy comes in really late in the discussion around the whole narrative. Second, they basically there is a major mistake I think in terms of I wanna say argument and discussion level, so let's leave it there. So it's more like this. The patriarchy issue comes really late, but they do not reframe the narratives in terms of what the patriarchy does and why the patriarchy use as a social system a specific set of narratives. And they treat the motherhood, monsterhood narrative as it is a product of a system and not something that has a specific function that reproduces the system itself. So this means that in terms of gender equality, the problem with gender equality in a patriarchal society is that gender equality in a patriarchal society effectively redefines what is the default entity. Instead of default male, gender equality forces patriarchy to acknowledge that default is not male. The problem with this is that this critic is too radical for what they do. They do not actually raise the issue of redefining the default. They do not want, for example, to make woman be as a category be no. They try to this third way, but it doesn't work because they're not saying that women should be the default, and at the same time, they're not asking to redefine male. So in any case, they are losing against a patriarchal system of codified gender roles and specific ideas and categories because they're not fighting it. They're accepting the premise. And they also mistake these narratives that I still think it's one narrative according to different perspectives and not three narratives, but I'm fine either way. They take it as a description in sense of, okay, they think, to use a kind of better metaphor, they think it's language in a sense of first Wittgenstein when it's clearly a linguistic act. In the sense that narratives are linguistic acts. They are not neutral. They even when they codify them as skewed on one gender, they do not assign them the specific role that these narratives have in society. They don't go look at quid prodest. So it's kind of disheartening there. And there is a really inbuilt failure when this kind of argument gets into a normative issue, a normative side, because it becomes a sort of protection of the status quo with minor changes. Instead of abolishing that patriarchal system, is can we please recognize that women are actors too? That is not the right consequence and not the right follow-up to an argument that identified, for example, some narration as specifically um, creating an actor incapable of action. You cannot say that, like, it doesn't follow, like, the premise doesn't, the whole argument around gender narratives does not imply that the solution is let's recognize women's actions as like, let's recognize the action of women. That's not what the issue were to the begin with, and if you made that the issue, you are just protecting the status quo and asking us to include women in men as a default category without changing the default category. It's the same as let's just say there is a big group of what you call shoes. Then one day we invent a new type of thing that you can walk on. It's like open and, you know, very futuristic, but like, it's fine. And for like centuries and centuries, that new type of things wear it's never been considered a shoe. It's been always considered a sock. Say it's a sock, it's a sock, it's a sock. At some point, we include this sock into the shoe category without any change in the definition of the shoe category. So now you have this big group of what is a shoe, that whose definition that didn't change, but in which there is a sock now. Okay, you can do that, but sorry if I'm not on board. Basically, I think that the argument itself that they make mistakes the context and aims of the narrative that they study, and does not account for the fact that the default role that males have in society, that is like the center of a patriarchal society, is always implicit condition that they accept in the object that they study. So failing to acknowledge patriarchy in this sense is a failure to being able to actually carry out a real critical discussion and argument. So what I will do now is briefly go through the conclusion. And let's see how it goes. Also, some people really should come down with the ease. Any other things you can shorten happily? Sorry to do this. So, I mean, the point now is that I have to do a COVID test, and I'm organizing that. And also, I'm talking to no one, so who cares? La 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 la. As that for the title. And this is solved. Pop! Me happy. La la la. No. Ooh, man, I mean, you have too many E's. Okay. We were somewhere around. That might be a problem. Okay. Yeah. Okay. After this brief cut of what the fuck they were trying to pull off in this book, let's go through the conclusions that you will show. It's like this book has a really deep epistemic problem at the beginning, and everything else fails. This is what happens when people try to use try to include feminist category, and they do like the minimum possible, because instead of actually do critical thinking or history of ideas, they went through, yes, let's add women to the default category. Yeah, that doesn't work. That's not if you don't change the default category, like if I have to talk about the group of of a group of people, and let's just say there is a group of people that is my flatmates, and if they are all female, I will say girls. If there is a man in that, I will say girls and guy, or guys, because language is patriarchal. But what won't happen is that I will still use girls. If you change the object of a group, you have to redefine the group. If you add women into the default normal, you will have to redefine the default normal, because the default normal is male. And if you don't see that like that's dangerous and potentially very idiotic. So in the first edition of this book, we are like in conclusion, so expect very normative proposal. Let's hope, because otherwise they did all this just to masturbate. Like, okay. We concluded with a call for the visibility of violent women in global politics. Maybe not. This is stupid. You have to define what kind of visibility. Okay, vabbè. Playing off of Daniel Byman and Kenneth Pollack's 2001 call to see the influence of great men in international arena, we asked what it would be like if bad women were also visible. They are very visible. You wrote an entire book about how are they visible. Oh, good God. They refer to an authentic version and an inauthentic version, but at least Heidegger had like the decency to distinguish the two and say that we use the two in normally. Well, no, actually the non-authentic is the more normal version that we use. Like, for the love of God. Who, by the way, is the product of someone with a penis. Never forget that. We proceed to extend Cinzia Enlil 1990 claim that the personal is international and the international is personal. No, the personal is political. If you don't remember that, you were not here in the 70s. To show the ways in which violent women's lives and international relations structure those violent women's life. And we live in a society, I still miss Hegel in this. It is that conclusion which has served as the premise for the analysis in this volume, where in chapter 2 we suggested that it is important to see everyday women's lives as global politics, and global politics is a key part of everyday women's life. In chapter 2 We complemented this with the other main argument that we made in the conclusion of the first edition of the book. The argument that existing theories of people's women's violence in global polity ask the wrong question about that violence and come to the wrong conclusion. Particularly, consider the question, why do women commit political violence? It is a flawed question for a number of reasons. First, it assumes that there is something essential about women as women that distinguishes the question, why do women commit political violence, from the question, why do people commit political violence in an intellectually meaningful way? And if they don't see, what is the point here? I mean, people are male. Like, I cannot, like, do I have to explain to you the fact that people are male in this context? Like, I know that I had a lot of mental gymnastics in my life when you read like men and you have to impose yourself in that category, because if you go into the female part of Aristotle, like, it's very grim for you. But like, when people say people, they say themselves. No. Like, if I say people, I usually include myself, but if an IELTS scholar says people, he will mean white man. And if you don't see that, there is meaningfully different asking, why do women commit violence and why do people commit violence inside the patriarchal society, if you don't see why it is meaningful for a patriarchal society and why it is meaningful inside a patriarchal society to ask that question from a critical standpoint, in a way that you would, actually underline the problems that patriarchy raises and the aporie. What is aporie in English? And I just saw faulty reasoning that the patriarchal system requires. Well, you have lost your mind if you don't think that's meaningful. Of course it's meaningful. It's meaningful for the patriarchy because the patriarchy assumes that women are not violent and are extremely violent at the same time. And it's meaningful for you as a feminist critic because you need to understand the reason why the question is important inside the patriarchy and outside the patriarchy, why the question is important, full stop. Because female and male violence is gendered differently and is different. Not in the outcome, not in the effects, not in the reasons. It's different because there are different gender roles. As long as there are different gender roles, you have different types of violence because they're codified inside different structures. And at this point, I'm kind of worried that you are assuming that there are propositions. And if that's the case, if you think that there are propositions, or if you think that there are things that are, true, like a true thing in the world, then I cannot help you. Because truth is something that you say regarding something that exists. And I cannot breach that line. I can arrive to proposition are always right because they're propositions, but that means they are tautological things that exist by logical necessity, so they're basically pointless. But I will not arrive to, and then there are, this is a true chair or not. This is a true, a true woman has meaning because it's said, it's an utterance and it refers to a concept. It's not a biologic, it's not a thing. The thing there is no woman or accessible to knowledge. Can we get there? Because I feel like you don't get there. Okay, stop. Instead, we argue that what makes the question about women's political violence specifically interesting to scholars, members of the media, and practitioners is the mistaken assumption that theories of people political violence are theories of men's political violence. because men are more naturally disposed to the commission of political violence. Yes, this is the problem that they have. They got this close to the reason why they're writing, the contextual reason why everything is like it is, and then they fly over the moon to the wrong side, like Ariosto, like they are Orlando looking like for the sand on the moon. Because think of that. They think that the question about political women specifically interesting to Scott, specifically interesting because it's based on the mistaken assumption that theories of people's violence are theories of men's political violence. And that is true, because contextually and historically, justified and reasonable political violence has always been a prerogative of men, because men are subjects, men are actors, and men are the default. So a description of people's political violence is the description of the default entity, so men's violence, explained for men to men. There is a discrepancy in power in terms of class and ethnicity and wealth, but there is no discrepancy in gender. Is a man explaining to other men why some men make violence. So they assume that their reasoning and others' reasoning is the same. They assume they have the same essential nature. They assume homogeneity. So if they're reasonable, everybody is reasonable and everybody is rationalized, and men's violence is rational. That is why, in other words, men's people this theories of people describe political violence are theory of men political violence because society has always been patriarchal. And instead of that argument, the factual reason why we have this description, because we have the description because people made them, you know, they are description of things, they are linguistic acts. They go like over the moon to someone else, like moon logic, completely out with because men are naturally disposed to the commission of political violence. No, that is the reason the men gave about that. That is the reason the men have for themselves to explain their own facts. And if you overlap a reasoning and explanation of an entity for itself with reason and explanation that you can explain and understand of that entity for the reason that the entity gives to itself, well, you are lost. You have nothing there. You are completely lost. It makes no sense. So, no, the conclusion is actually a bit long, so this we push in half an hour, and I will have to eat some point, so let's go faster. Okay, men are naturally disposed to violence. Also, men are naturally tend to knowledge. It's self-description actually. Like Agostino really had problem with his own dick, so men have problems with lust and so on. Like St. Paul had notoriously seriously problem with his own dick. So you read like, oh, la carne è debole, I want to do good but still I have erections. Like St. Paul was a man with deep problems with his own erections. I think that was because he was not part of the gay traveling band with Jesus, so he didn't understood how to accept himself as gay. That's my working argument. In this framing, men political violence is normalized and women's is understood to be exceptional, both representationally and substantively. There is no connection there. Women's understood to be exceptional because they have no access to women's reasoning, because women's are different in a patriarchal society. Again, they do not go through self-explanation, nor trust self-explanation of women when they commit violence, but they trust theories that are self-explanation of men that commit violence as trustworthy, and also as truth, because yes, it's trustworthy when, like Machiavelli speaks about, I know it's trustworthy, I'm fine, but you are trustworthy as you, specific man in specific time and place. So if I don't trust you, if you try to like convince me that I am useless and not think and not able to think, sorry, like therefore, the question of why women commit political violence is problematic and is the reification of gender stereotypes and what women are. I will not even comment this one. This is way too stupid. Second, because no, the reification of gender stereotypes. The called gender roles. It's not a reification. It's basically essentialism, and I don't care if you think that this is concluding this argument. It's an assumption that it's always present. Next. Secondly, though, research asks the question of why women commit political violence is troublesome, an assumption inherent in the framing of the question. Most work asks why political violence is committed by women invokes the troubling tropes in the modern most of narratives, suggest that women have little agency in the violence, and all picture perpetrators of political violence as autonomous agents. In global politics, even are grounded in feminist political theories, autonomy in the fluidity of gender. We are well concerned about the importance of transcending the dichotomy that seems to be present in itself, wherein people who commit political violence and make fully independent choices, usually men, or have no choice in their behavior, usually women. We have always been concerned about the asking of why question about women's political violence open up. Yeah, I know. Have a strong likelihood that work will fall on the side of the dichotomy or the other, especially given the assumption the question makes about women's commonalities. Because you are assuming women as an homogeneous group that you want to study from the outside. Men study men's political violence, and they start with themselves. We study women's political violence, we don't start with ourselves, rationalizing our violence. If you study an X as a part of the group X, it's different than studying an X as part of the group Y. Just that. There is the difference between insider and outsider when explaining behavior of a group. It's that. Like, just that. Whatever. Third, then, we have always been concerned that even when it's a good idea to ask why women commit political violence, many of the answer to the question in existing study come up short. In chapter 2, we pointed out that many theories of people's violence in global politics, there are explicit or implicit masculinist notion on why people commit violence. There's still no clear reference to the fact that this is all a patriarchal problem or a problem in a patriarchal society. The narration have a specific role on enforcing patriarchal society and so on. Like, all the critical thinking on this, in the sense of critical theory, could protest, why this specific linguistic act is carried out, by whom was the enforcers, what are the punishment for when you break this rule, are not taken into consideration. all the real feminist thinking that should have been done here is absent. Um, in other words, gender neutral theories such as social linear theory, psychoanalytic theory, rational choice theory, radicalization theory, and evolutionary theory. Okay, I remember those. Social linear theory was not gender neutral. Psychoanalytic theory was not a theory, it was Freud, and definitely never gender neutral, never even tried to be gender neutral. Rational choice theory, model gender neutral, is like all humans are rational completely, so 50-50 gender neutral, but this just because like the object is just God is the only entity that's able to be the actor in a gender neutral in the rational choice theory argument. Radicalization theory was kind of interesting, but I don't remember how much gender neutral. And evolutionary theory was not an evolutionary theory, and was not even a sexual evolutionary theory. Was just misogyny. Was just a regurgitation of misogynistic shit. I remember that one. It never claimed to be gender neutral when you start with sexual selection. What is the neutrality? Whatever. Often carry out with them the assumption about men's behavior as men and are applied to women's without analysis of the invisibility of women and femininity in their casual tales of violence. So women's violence terrorize at all. We have argued that the invisibility of women in and the stereotyping of women in theories of people's violence makes those theories inaccurate, not only about the women who commit political violence whose stories being featured in the Mother, Monster and Horror chapters in the books, but about everyone to whom they are applied, because they are constituted by partial gendered assumption about what people are and how they work. Yeah, well, let's assume that do they know what is a category? Do they know that a category comes before? Like, a category in this case is an anticipation of perception. Like, are they asking an anticipation of perception to be a posteriori and synthetic? Because not like, are they asking for syllogism? Like, are they asking to go to Hegel and go for a syllogism of political violence, people's political violence? But even then, I'm kind of baffled by how they use categories and like how they use their own logical like building blocks in this book is very weird. The solution then is not to continue to apply gender and masculine theories of political violence to men only, and to develop new sex-specific theories of people's violence in global politics to apply to politically violent women. Just say women's violence. If you have to apply to women, say that. It is that sort of impulse which leads to some of the gendered assumption of women's violence that constitute the Mother, Monster and Horror narratives. No, actually. If you have to develop a gendered female theory of women's violence, you have to develop it on its own. You don't have to start with what is already there, right? I will try to not kill them at this point. It is why in chapter 2 we argue that the specific theory of women's violence have two main problems: the separation of women's violence and men's violence as analytical categories in theory, and in the stereotypes and sensationalism that end up characterizing theories of women's violence in practice. And now I have a question, because I remember what kind of theories you analyzed then. Did you think that sex-specific theories of women's violence were actually made by women, not even that, were actually independent, like, of men's violence theories. Like, seriously, as a specific theory of women's violence. Where do you start from? With violent women, you ask what they do, and blah blah blah, and grow that thing. Oh, you're a woman and you analyze why you feel violent, something like that. Like what men did a long time ago when they started the shit. Instead, those theories were just uh, what would I say? Were some kind of, instead of being women according to themselves, or women according, like, violent women according to themselves, or violent women according to women, was violent women according to patriarchal society. So of course they fall back into the patriarchal society categories. Like, they were there from the start. Like, it was that from the start. So fuck. Still, it is inappropriate to suggest that gender is irrelevant to anyone's political violence and to any phenomenon in global politics. Instead, we suggest a third path, rejecting falsely gender-neutral theories of the causes of people's violence in global politics as a specific characterization of women's commission of political violence. This path changes the analytical framework for thinking about political violence and the sort of analysis being done. In terms of analytical framework, we discussed the interaction looking at global politics, general and political violence specifically through gender lenses. This analytical framework sees gender as a set of constant evolving social assumptions and expectations that serve as regulatory ideas, structuring frameworks, options, and valuable resources in people's lives. I'm very happy about that, but they never applied it. Because they treat the gender role of mother as the same in, like, every time, everywhere. So yes, you can use a new analytical framework, but never like, you can talk about it, but you cannot use it, because the media, like, someone in the 70s in Italy doing Brigate Rosse shit, and like a Muslim woman in the Palestinian occupied territories in 2005. Same mother, like, same thing. Chechenian woman, Palestinian woman, ancient Greek in mythology. The same mother, like, mother is the same role. It's the same shit. It's completely and easily comparable, right? But, like, gender is a set of constantly evolving social structures. By the way, if gender is a set of constantly evolving social assumptions and expectations, who sets those assumptions and expectations has an important point, and, like, is an important point. Social assumptions and expectations are not neutral. Linguistic acts are not neutral. Like, we cannot go back there and, like, gender lenses ask how gender is present but invisible both in the lives of those who commit political violence and the theories most often leveraged to explain them. And no, you did not do that. You clearly did not do that. It is obvious that you not do that. If this is your suggestion, suggested that part, why didn't you do that? What were you doing in the meanwhile before? Like, you have this idea, you don't make it, and then in the conclusion, this is our suggestion, and yeah, were you sleeping in the rest of the book? Okay. It is the latter set of questions that inspired us originally to suggest that a rational autonomy framework is a good starting point to understand people's violence in global politics. I would have suggested, like, Hegel, or common sense, or, like, everything can be said in a language is linguistic, and intersubjectivity, because, God, Davidson but I mean everybody chooses its own, so they go with a relational autonomy and they don't use it. They don't do critical analysis of the narrative. They don't do that. They say what is the narrative, they put some examples, and they get on with their lives by saying, oh, this is this analysis, this is what, like, this is this. But, like, do you think you have a modern monster horror narrative casually? Or because people, like, do you think all this is casual? Or just tradition? Why do you think this? Do you think this has no aim, no meaning, as a linguistic description, or do you don't you think this is a linguistic act that has a specific aim? Like, like. We therefore concluded our analysis in the first edition and started our analysis in this edition with the argument about the relational autonomy based in feminist political theory. This is how we looked to change the sort of analysis done, but definitely not your own. Instead of us suggesting that women lack agency in their violence, or that many individuals who commit political violence are fully autonomous agents with a full menu of possible choices. No, those are just people who play. Oh, no, they're not people who play girls. Okay, video games are done. I'm not expert on that. We look for analysis that took in account of the interdependence, intersubjective, and incomplete independence of factors and global politics. The feminist theories have since they started applying gender analysis to global politics. I kind of mixed up something that's that, but I don't care. By the way, I think they understand because the rest of the book is just analysis of people who did not do what they suggest they should have done, but they never say what is the result or what they suggest they should have done. But instead of looking at for why women and people more generally, women choose political violence, we interrogated the notion of choice itself as traditionally construed. No, you did not. I was there, you did not. We have argued that people do not make choice independent of whether the other people or the social structure around them. No, you did not argue that. Everybody ever argued that who was a philosopher. We have like slightly different things, but an entity that is able to make choice independently of anything is just God. So scholastics, people make choice independently of their possibilities. Aristotle, possibilities depend on acts. Like even that, like he went like totally. You start like and then he went on like we. Also, not even the notional choice in the sense that the notional choice they're using is the post-Christian, like post-Saint Augustine one, when there is free will. So let's assume and be historical everything after Saint Augustine, not before, because we don't want to cheat in that. So all true scholastic people do not make choice absolutely. That's only God. Modern times, you have some people who argue that we are unable to make choice. Some people who argue that we can like make choice and not make choice, like third antinomy. So all people who argue a kind of middle ground that exactly you make choice according to what's your possibilities. Still, the opposite, that people do not make any choice, or that there are not discernible people who can choose, also does not resonate. with Hirschman, who argue that people do make choices, but those choices are both heavily and differently constrained. With Hirschman. I will not go into this again. By heavily constrained, we mean that a wide variety of social structure and expectation signification play a role in constituting conditional possibility for choices and the choices themselves. Okay, I agree if and only if the people who are choosing in this context are female and the constraints of the patriarchy. If you don't specify those things, this is just all shit. Same old shit. Abbiamo avuto la fottuta scelta della scelta con Kierkegaard. Non puoi svegliarti ora e dirmi seguiamo uno che nel 1989 ha detto la scelta è sociale. E sti cazzi, after Kierkegaard, who choose to choose, you are telling me this. This has meaning if and only if it is a linguistic act specifically destined to identify patriarchal society and women's role and the gender role attributed to women inside those. It has meaning if my choice is being able to abort and the heavily constraints the constraints that are heavily put on me are, abortion laws, objectional conscience inside the hospitals and so on. If it's not that, it's just a rehash of something old. This is what happens when you try to be the default or gender neutral or try to not be actually for women. By differential constraint, we mean that both the level and type of constraints differ across people position in social and political life based on gender, race, class, nationality, and other features of opposition in global politics. And you just lost me. Because that is just basic. And what is complication in the question of issues will lead us originally to an interesting representation of women's values and global politics for two reasons. First, given the problems that we saw with the why question, both in form and terms of gender and essentialism, we were interested in moving the focus away from why women commit political violence to the ways that women's political violence are received differently than men's political violence, even when or if it's no different phenomenon. You argue into very different issues there. If they argue that this is a different phenomenon and you assume that it is not, and you try to explain why they argue that it is a different phenomenon, you first have to explain to me why it is not. Or you have to underline that they assume that, and that is wrong. Just. Second, we saw the gender discourse of women's violence and global policy are constitutive of political awareness of the condition of that violence, which meant that reading and understanding the significance of women's violence and global policy was important on how it is received and understood, which was initially and remains our primary research concern. The edition conclusion starts at rather than ending with that question: what are the significations of women's values and global policy, and why do they matter? Wait. Significations? It's not signifier, it's not meaning. What is significations? Start with that question because in the conclusion we want to push analysis further to explore the ways in which those significations constitute women's political violence by association with women's and political violence. We want to understand common signification to read the possible ways in which statistics of signification of women's violence and global politics might help produce alternative understanding of extralegal political violence on women. violence in global politics. No, a women's participation during cosa sarebbe? Signification? No, perché the representation of a conveying of meaning. Just meaning. That's why it's keeping me. It's meaning. Significante, significato. Signified and signifier. Peace. Sign, signifier, and signified. Whatever. The third section of the chapter suggests that the signification of political violence has felt and experienced, exploring the implication of such a such a signification for understanding what people's political violence is and the role gender plays in constituting it. The chapter ends by looking forward to the continuation of a such program looking at women, gender, and political violence. So, significations of women's violence, when we call the mother, most of all narratives. Narratives, they should call it narrative, singular, but okay. You were saying something both about the structure and about the content, but you did not analyze what are the connections between the two and why, for example, it is a syllogism. From what I read, it works as a syllogism. Mother is the positive, mother is the thesis, monster is the antithesis, horror is the synthesis. Or actually, it's not even that. It's more like nurturing mother is the thesis, monster is the antithesis, and the violent mother is the synthesis. Then you have horror as the monster, and then you have the mediation. The mother is the mediator, is the mediator term for horror. Because it's mother, whore, violent mother, or monster, mother, whore, monster, and so like there is a connection between those, and it's like clear in the sense that if you can see them, also themselves, they recognize that like mother's narratives are also monster narratives and whore narratives. Like there is no actual clear definition. That's why I think it should be like one big category, but that's me. Another is a story about an event or set an event accounting for another show leadership. A nominal narrative is one spoken by a voices which receive a substantial audience such that the dominant narrative becomes the account of women's violence. They are managing to cut out politics from the narratives of women's violence. And it's like completely ironic in my mind that they do this after pages and pages in which they say that this narrative cut out politics from the accounts of women's violence, but they cut out politics from these narratives. Like a dominant narrative, but it's not political. No patriarchal. It's just dominant. Why is it dominant? I don't know. It happens. It's the mainstream. You know. Oh god, sono arrivati giovedì scorso. The audience then internalize the narrative in their own intellectual, emotional, even sensory understanding of the events, set of the event narratives, often in the form of stories or metaphors, frame complicated events to fit into discrete categories, allowing people to process large amount of information with limited cognitive capacity. As Daniel explained, a communicative move, verbal or non-verbal, could be understood without reference to a meta-communicative message or meta-message about what is going on. That is, the frame interpretation applies to the move. Please patriarch in this to appear. That is to say that no communication independent of frames and is spoken or well through. No, it becomes. I read an analytical philosopher who read Kant. Good job, baby. For example, though most people do not understand the diversity of species of snakes, most people can describe what they mean by the word snake, and no one when they see it. I will not even I cannot. Just read Kant again and go like Kant, the second Wittgenstein, and John Austin on linguistic arts. Possibly read that, please. Also, I would say Hegel, and in this case, you need to read the dialectic of illuminism. Really. I know Adorno was very, very racist, but you need this. Because if you need to explain that way, that is a category. That is Plato. And you cannot try to explain, to reduce that to Plato. When you say that no communication is dependent on the frame is spoken and held through, it's not about the category of snake recognizing a snake. That is just applying. That is just like basic Kant, not being stupid in a Kantian sense. Now, what they're talking about is that snake as a category, as the frame is spoke through its language, and also the aim of the communication. If I say snake, and we go into linguistic arts, if I say snake and I scream it at someone, I hope that the someone will be smart enough to understand that it's so a snake and I'm telling him that. This type of whatever, people, narrative theorists argue, use this shortcut category to understand the fact in the lies from personal relationship to global politics. It's not the narrative theorists argue this. This is I will Husserl is crying somewhere in his tomb. There is Husserl crying now while I read this. Metaphorical and associative categories serve a dual function in people's memory's capacity. They organize events that people see and digest, and they serve as prediction for destruction and the situation the people face. So someone ripped off Kant like there was no tomorrow. Is it me? Lack of 1993. Someone read Kant. They're called judgment and anticipation or perception in this case. I mean, this is the difference between categories and lo schematismo trascendentale. Transcendental categories, I would say judgment and transcendental categories. I would say, I think that's how they translated this in English. So, for example, when confronted with a new task, many people categorize the task like a similar task that they do know how to do, and extrapolate how to accomplish the new task on knowledge on the similar one. Discussing and explaining people's values and appropriate play a similar role, as used to explain the word imitates a word narrative, imitates word, and one word narrative to figures are of capital importance. The protagonist and the antagonist. The protagonist, the hero of the whole story, are usually space in the whereas there are reams and reams of heroic verses. There is no such thing as an enemy verse, because that tell our story and sense of the victors. Okay, there is a lot of actor in the Iliad. I will not go further. In this way, war narratives are the foundation which create the possibility of war and direct war fighting. In the seven at Thebe, you know, Laios city, there are like the seven at Thebe is like the description of all the sevens who are invading Thebe. Thebes probably? Whatever. In triumphal war narratives, the actual number of victims are for their innocence and guilt a secondary consideration. What counts is the capacity to kill the triumphal narrative of the enemy. Whatever. The best war stories do not only win the war, it is the war. In this way, wars and war narratives are not discrete phenomena, but part of the same war in the same whole. Houston confirms that it is crucial to conceive of this physical violence as being linguistic as well, and linguistic violence as physical as well. It is this dynamic, so I mean, they are recognizing the linguistic act exists, but it is this dynamic which are interested in capturing and thinking about narratives of people violence and global politics. Stories of people violence and global politics look to characterize the people committing violence within broader conflict narrative as heroes or victims, and place this within the groups of heroes or victims. Yeah, but the audience is not the same. Like USA bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there is a narrative for. It's not as simple as they make, because audience matters in this case, and the author of the narrative matters too. Conflict would have more than one belligerent, more than one side, and more than one narrative. Narratives of conflict and of participation therein compete as those fighting compete. In other words, there is no story which is objectively true or universally accepted, but several stories which could be the story of a king of a war on conflict. But if you win, that's your story. See Caesar the Bello Gallico. He was right. That's why we do propaganda from long time ago. Also to Children and Pericle, I love that there is like history books. The second history book we have in terms of written, it's like okay, and then we went from with like that. Go Filippo! In this competition, domination came in a form of attention. Somebody argued that we live in a world of referendum, where a silent messages present themselves a question and some format. Because aspiring truths compete, political and social research cannot be carried out wholly within the alloyed logic of a single pure formative discourse. On the contrary, actual inquiries depend on every practice that involve astrologic mediation among different formative discourses employed in relation to one another. This is kind of right, kind of wrong, and deeply not on the point of this book. Among the many possible narratives of women's violence and global politics, we found complementary but distinguishable both mother, monster, and whole narratives dominate the competition to account for acts of violence committed by women. Those narratives dominate largely, but not entirely, without the contribution of women who commit the violence in question. More often than not, the narratives are largely, if not entirely, propagated by people who object to the violence that has been perpetrated, and as a political name is their own victim, and advocates for the legal system transgressors or stakeholders in political notions of women political violence and for women's political violence. So narratives are political, we get that, probably not really, but yay. The problem is that, do you acknowledge that, like, these are narratives, so these narratives create reality, at least social reality, or not? Because if you don't do it, we can say goodbye and go home. For that reason, we have been interested in exploring how the modern of narratives constitute this subject. Below, we explore the in-depth guided by the concept of signification. Women's political violence, women and political violence signified in and by the mother monster of narratives. Wait, said women political violence are signified. Well, yes, by signified we mean that it is implied by the narratives, and what we mean what is implied by the narrative, and what beliefs and understanding about the subject they bring into the system sustain. That's not what signified means. You mean with signified you mean implied, because there is no signification triangle here. There is no sign signifier and signified, unless you account for the narrative as the sign, women's violence and the signified, and then what is the signifier? There is no signifier in this. There are two entities. The sign, there is a narrative, and the signified by the narratives. And then you might add probably like the aim of the narrative, but it's not in a signifier triangle. Women's political violence, as we discussed throughout the text of the book, the mother monster and her narrative signify women's violence first as a phenomenon. They use pills like I want to cry. A phenomenal distinction from women's violence, that is, in these narratives, women's violence is different because it is women's. Yet another violence is not property of womanhood, quite the contrary. Young normal women are understood not to commit political violence, but to be peaceful and nurturing. Women's violence, then, it is the property of womanhood gone wrong, a broken or flawed femininity. In other words, in the modern narrative, women's violence is a product of motherhood gone wrong. A nurturing woman a nurturing mother nurtures bad men, and a vengeful mother is violent because she has lost her purpose in life when she has lost those for whom she serves as wife and mother. In the monster narrative, it takes a particular psychological disturbed version of femininity, one which is scary and even monstrous, to commit a particular sort of violence that women commit, women's violence. In the whole narratives, women's sexuality is something other than the desire ability to please and reproduce with men, whose traditional feminine sexuality is somehow broken, Adam says broken, and therefore more likely to commit this special sort of violence that is women's political violence. In other words, women's political violence is signified as something that women do, but not the women, only women, whose femininity is somehow maladjusted. The maladjusted femininity is a property which constitutes women's political violence as at once a broken part of femininity and an outside of the direct control of the woman who is committing the violence. In other words, many of the presentation of women's political violence is in the mother monster whole narrative signify it as a perpetratorless sort of violence, one without a person making the choice to commit the violence. On the contrary, normal political violence, that is political violence that is presented as sex neutral but really means men's political violence, kudos for finding out what the fault means, is presented as a sort of violence which has a perpetrator. This manufactured distinction makes an implication not only about what relative capabilities men and women have, but about what men are and what political no, what women are, what political value is discussed in more detail in the following section. If you think about it, they're getting this all wrong, because this manufacturing distinction, okay, not does not make an implication that only about alternative creates an implication. It is made to create an implication. It is made by the patriarchal society in order to reproduce a patriarchal society in which women have a specific approved gender roles, and the gender roles is the one of a nurturing woman, with possibly heterosexual, but that depends on the specific area in which the patriarchy exists. So it's not that this distinction makes implication, it's that this distinction causes, creates. These are narratives that create the implication, they create the reality, they create the fact that women are incapable of violence without being problematic. Because it has to excise, to cut out the problematic instance of a woman that might not fit inside the gender role that the patriarchal society gave her. They are mistaken. They are taking this all wrong. They don't see the political implication, or they don't want to see the political implication and the political need of these narratives. And that is why this shit. It's absurd. Oh, Benjamin Brief arrived. Iowa is fine. Okay. I really. Women, as we mentioned in the introduction, each time the mother monster of narrative deployed, they present an account of women's violence that alienates women from the capacity to make independent or independent choices to commit violence. The mother monster of narrative juxtaposes alienation with assumption that no female humans have the capacity to make such decisions, and female made violence are chosen autonomy from among a range of possible choices. No, 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 no. You're mistaking narrative as description when they are creation of society. You will be the one who think that a myth, a Greek myth, is a story of reality and not like these are people who read the Iliad and think, oh yes, it's a story of a war, instead of, oh no, it's an encyclopedia. What were you doing when you read and you wrote the like narratives? This after writing the narratives are narratives frame complicated events to fit into discrete categories. No communicative move, verbal or non-verbal, could be understood without reference to meta-communicative messages or meta-message about what is going on. If they don't see that this is political, that the meta-communicative message is a linguistic card that says women stay in your lane, I mean, I cannot help you. But you are out of your mind if you don't see this. Okay, we get to women part. They still get it wrong. They keep getting wrong why there are these narratives. uh, as they basically they aim at the wrong issue. Instead of aiming to patriarchy, they're aiming to whatever, something else. Definitely not patriarchy. As long as women are seen are capable compared to men at anything, the main female dichotomy is reified and reassigned a main salient. In other words, the method to add the mother monster holds narrative stereotype and marginalize the women who are subject to the story in which they are deployed. The women who commit political violence, but it matters more to us than the means for all people who are understood to be women. Then the narrative casts violent women in a negative light, but they also make implications about what normal, regular women are. No, really? Chi l'avrebbe detto? Why would you think they're doing this? No, really, like, is this like... Uh, whatever. The assumption that women are generally incapable of violence is a condition of possibility. They again move the point outside of what is happening, because what is happening is not like when you say that the narratives cast women are violent, negative lie, but make a some implication about what normal regular women are. You don't see that they don't like. They make implication because they want those implications to be taught. They want those implications to become real. They are creating those implications. They are creating a gender role of a woman. If you don't see that this is part of a creation and reinstatement of a specific gender role for women, I mean, I don't know how I can help you, because I don't think I can. It's not an assumption. You are making an issue of... You're mistaking a narrative for a declarative message. It is really not. The notion of femininity, a space for warning. Yeah, no, they still do not see that a narrative is creating these gender roles. They keep going with this. We argue that the signification of mother, maternal roles are problematic, but they don't see what these... They are problematic, these narratives, but they don't see what these narratives do. This very notion of femininity traps women into idealized roles, which threatens gender equality in a number of ways. Oh, sweet summer child. Oh, darling. Oh. What were you doing until now? Being birthed? Did you arrive 10 minutes ago? Like, what is happening? Are you wishing for the final moment of patriarchy? We were there. We were expecting this the whole time. You don't get brownie points from telling me the problem and the end without like actually using the problem as a critical category during. Like, you don't get that. This is not a sexual encounter. You don't have to get me to orgasm. You just have to like use a category throughout. The impact of this gender subordination discourse on gender equality is twofold. First, I will not go there. A discussion about the surface level discourse and marginalizing both women and men. Second, the discourse of subordination is material in women's life around the world. Subjectivity is performative, character and performance in political and social international relations is material. And its interpretation, sex and gender are both discursive constructs. Subjectivity is lived and performed in people's discursive and material relationship, meaning that if women are held to be less able very useful YouTube. That's I mean disabled. It will be treated as disabled, that zone will reflect a lesser ability, women's education will pander to one inability, and women could become through these material relationships unable to do what they actually can do because women might not believe in their own abilities. I would rephrase it because women's gender role in society depends on what these narratives allow women to do. So it's basically it's a material relationship because women are able to do what they actually can do because women are constrained by what they can do according to the narratives. But okay, yet rational women are not disabled, we fight against stereotypes. This is not an issue of stereotypes, you are not seeing patriarchy, so meh. Okay, is gender subordination when you refuse minimize women's ability to commit violence, but the most of narratives are not the cause of gender subordination, and here they are kind of wrong. This suggest that this narrative are examples of a broader trend of recognition and inclusion of women that leaves in place discursive structures of gender oppressions. So kind of we are arriving to patriarchy, kind of. No. Okay, this is going through like the same beats, nothing new. They went through the international community and trials, but not in details. Finally, some active these narratives about women's extralegal violence provide boundaries to define what normal women look like. Finally, they arrive into an actual factual truth sentence. There are also seven institutions to define who the acceptors perpetrator or the acceptable violence are, and women are not among those acceptable perpetrators. Finally, narratives are an active role. Feminists continue to ask where women are in political violence, so I imagine what were women at by feminists? By contrast, men's violence is often characterized as within the control of the rational decision processes, che l'avrebbe detto. Political violence is not only gender that the mother and honor to constitute misleading in problematic ways. These narratives associate political violence to men's political violence. I mean, signify political violence as men's political violence. Because women's political violence is outside, I would argue that is the reverse, because men's political violence is the default is people's political violence. The default is never seen. The use of mother monster narrative constitutes political violence in opposition to the differentiated phenomenon of women's political violence. blah blah blah. They still get to political, that's nothing interesting in here. They get to agency now. Embrace women's agency. Okay, they mention recognition agency, so I think they're coming through an actual intersubjective description of agency. Maybe they relate the recognition of women's agency to the subversion of gender oppression, arguing that they must embrace agency not only as the best of women and also the worst of women. That like I'm kind of worried because agency is a character or an ability that we recognize or recognize as innate into people. So they want to go to gender equality by questioning scholars on biases. Okay, critiquing a focus of agency in the AHAL 2012 is argued that the agency is not related to material self but as an effect of the operation of the scarce power through which subjects are produced. So we get into something smart, and they keep going with, in other words, the question how much agency people have interaction based on assumption that persons as instrumental actors who confront the external political field when actually politics and power is interrogated at the level at which a subject and its agency are articulated and made possible. Therefore, agency can be presumed only at the cost of refusing to inquire into its construction. I would like to read this woman actually now. Like, really? Rosenio? Nice and interesting thing. I will read that. Seems like an interesting take that I actually will explore more. They argue with Hirschman that while the self, imagine, is an identifiable entity, both the self and its political choices are contextualized within an interdependent and constraining social world, which influences both the identity of the self and the availability of choices that the self has. And, like, okay. And this framing. Operation of the scarce power subjects are produced, and the mother monster whole narrative is why didn't you do that during the analysis? In those terms, we were interested in the way that the narrative is operation of the scarce power that produce women as subject without them just men as subject with agencies. No. They produce the contest. You are crazy. Like those narratives, not that they produce an agent. whatever. Now view the problem with is narrative, the construction of the agent only agent dichotomy on sex lines. Jessica 8, 2012 continuously critiques arguing in the first edition of Madame Osso's agents remains an attribute to Max entrance into legitimate political community despite a potential problem with a fundamentalist conception of agency. Those who write on the topic of women and theories are driven by the desire to emancipate women by ascribing agents into their subjectives. This may be a critique. The spending time to critiquing the criticals. Bah. Agency, the currency by which political subjects are often recognized in Western liberal thought, according to which is gender and are racialized in a number of different ways. No. I think this time I stop because we're getting nowhere. Then they quote Judith Butler, and I think this may be interesting. Butler is definitely something I would go to. Then there is looking forward to, but before that they identify some steps to signify political violence. The first step is question the representation of sex and gender and narratives on women's political violence. A second step is provide various representations of women who commit political violence that look to question and overturn stereotypical and gender subordinated notion of those women and their violence. And the third step, an active disruption of those dominant discourses, whether present themselves. Whether blog posts, newspapers, scholarly work. And this is very. They wrote the conclusions, right? So they should be able to. I don't know. And this is the end basically. Linda Ahal 2012 A. What I want to know is if the head of this motherhood meet a gender agency in political violence. I like this woman. Let's find this thing or at least put a pin in that. This book is profoundly meh. It has great ideas, great, like, not even great, but like, he wishes well, but never gets to the end line. And it has also a worst flaw. it doesn't recognize what it's arguing for and against, and it happens a lot in this book that they argue for explicitly for something, or in favor of something, or they say they are using some analytical tools, but they don't actually apply that. They squander their potential, they squander their conclusion, they squander their general argument in the worst possible way. It's a no. It says it does, like, it means what? It has good ideas, it collects good ideas, but it doesn't get to the point, and when it gets to the point you find out that it never used what it acquired in getting to the point. It's just wasted. And okay, maybe not it's just wasted, and I don't like that.